The room was made of smooth grey concrete and silence. Not the kind of silence you find in a library. This was the kind that swallowed sound. The kind that meant the walls were thick, the door was steel, and the outside world was irrelevant. Camille sat, motionless. The air conditioning unit in the corner hissed, a mechanical lung struggling to breathe life into the dead space. The only other man in the room, Etienne, was the source of all the weight. He didn't just take up space, he demanded it. He was built heavy, not fat, but dense. A solid block of a man whose shoulders seemed too wide for any doorway. His head sat low on his thick neck, giving him the appearance of a dangerous, immovable brute. The tailored suit, black, crisp, did nothing to soften the outline. It just packaged the threat neatly. Camille had seen men like him before, in the periphery of her father's crumbling world, men who dealt in loss and zero-sum games. But they were usually slick, angular, predators built for speed. Etienne was built for crushing. He was at the far end of a long, dark wood table, an absurd piece of furniture designed for negotiations that would never happen here. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes, just watching, waiting for the exhaustion to finish the work his men started. Camille shifted her spine against the hard, cheap plastic chair. She fought the need to rub her wrists, where the zip ties had chafed the skin raw hours ago. Small victories. Don't show the weakness. "Are we talking or are we playing statues?" she finally asked. Her voice was dry, a rasp against the heavy silence. Etienne didn't flinch. He just tilted his head, a movement so slight it barely registered. "Waiting," he finally replied. His voice was low, gravelly. It didn't project. It vibrated through the floor. "For what? For me to cry?" He smiled then, a flicker that didn't reach his eyes. It was a cold, tired expression. "The crying is optional. The understanding is not." He reached out and pushed a small, bound file across the table. The action was slow, deliberate. He had large hands. The knuckles were thick, scarred. Hands that understood force. The file stopped precisely at the edge of her side of the table. She didn't touch it. She knew what was inside. Numbers, debts, her father's signature on the paperwork that sold her freedom. "I know the number," Camille said. "The number changes," Etienne said, leaning back slightly. The leather of his chair squeaked under his considerable weight. "The debt doesn't. Your father was a dreamer. Bad business. He thought he could pay you back. Everyone thinks that, until they stand here." Etienne paused. He picked up a cigarette from a silver case on the table. He didn't light it, just held it, turning it over between his thumb and index finger. Camille studied him again. She noted the heavy brow, the small, almost defensive way he held his posture, despite his obvious physical dominance. She realized something crucial, something others must have missed when looking at the blunt instrument of his body. He was aware of his size, always compensating, always maneuvering the world to fit him, because he knew he didn't fit the world. "They called you the Rock," Camille challenged, watching his reaction. Etienne dropped the unlit cigarette back into the case. Click. Final. "They called me worse," he corrected. "The difference is I don't care what they call me. I care what they deliver. I am the delivery. You are collateral. There is a difference." His eyes finally fixed on her. They were a flat, dark brown, giving nothing away. "Collateral is temporary, until the real payment arrives." "And when will that be?" "When I decide the real payment has arrived." The conversation was a pointless loop, a test of endurance. Camille felt the energy draining out of her, not from fear, but from the sterile frustration of the confinement. She needed air. She needed noise. Not this cold, deliberate nothing. Etienne stood up. The chair shrieked against the polished floor. His movement was surprisingly fluid for his build. He didn't lumber. He moved with the grounded, heavy grace of something built low to the earth. The distance between them, which had felt immense across that ridiculous table, vanished instantly. He walked around the table, stopping directly behind her chair. Camille froze. Every muscle tightened. The threat wasn't in his words now. It was in the sudden, overwhelming proximity of his physical self. She could smell the faint, expensive scent of his wool suit, mixed with something earthy, like tobacco and cold iron. "You are tired," he stated, not asking. "I am done," she countered, refusing to turn her head. Looking at him meant yielding. He placed his hands on the back of her chair. They were so large they spanned the width of the thin plastic backing easily. His thumbs brushed the delicate curve of her neck just beneath her hairline. A feather-light touch that carried the implied weight of a wrecking ball. "You should look at me when you speak," he instructed. The sound was right next to her ear, deep and resonant. No. A moment of pure, heavy stillness. The only sound was the failing air conditioner. He didn't force her. That was the surprising cruelty of it. He just maintained the pressure. His hands stayed on the chair, framing her. She felt small, ridiculously, dangerously small. "They always said I was too big," Etienne murmured. The words meant more for himself than for her. "Too much, too loud when I moved, too rough when I touched." Camille held her breath. This was the vulnerable spot, the chip on the massive shoulder. The reason the other families, the sleek, old money operators, always kept him at arm's length. He was the force they needed, but the size they despised. He was built for the dark, not the drawing room. "I don't care about your feelings," Camille managed, the defiance shaking slightly. "Good. Feelings are messy, unreliable." He leaned closer. She could feel the heat radiating off his body, a furnace trapped inside the expensive cloth. "But size, that is real. It is constant." He gently lifted one of his enormous hands from the chair and moved it to her shoulder. He didn't grip. He just rested the edge of his palm there. It was enough. Her shoulder, small and sharp beneath the thin silk of her blouse, disappeared under the expanse of his hand. He didn't move the hand. He simply let the contrast exist, the immense scale of him against the fragility of her. "I need things that fit," Etienne continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I have spent my whole life being too much for everything: rooms, cars, women." He pressed down slightly. Just a small, controlled pressure. Camille sucked in a sharp breath. Not pain, just the realization of how easily he could erase her. "Your father thought he could deal with me," Etienne said, shifting the subject back to the business, the source of her current terror. He saw the size and assumed the lack of intelligence, a common mistake. He needed the money. And I needed the compliance. He gave me you. His hand finally moved, traveling slowly, deliberately, down her arm. The movement was a deep violation, not because of lust, but because of control. It was the feeling of a heavy shadow passing over sunlight. He took her small, cold hand in his. Her fingers were swallowed by his palm. They looked like the bones of a bird trapped in a bear's paw. "Look at that," he commanded, a strange, possessive satisfaction in his tone. "See how easily you disappear." Camille finally turned her head, slowly, defying the instinct to recoil. She looked up at him. She had to tilt her chin sharply to meet his eyes. Up close, the density of his face was startling. Hard lines, the shadow of stubble. He looked perpetually tired, perpetually ready for a fight. "You want me to be afraid of your hands," she stated, cutting past the subtext. "I want you to be aware of them." He released her hand, only to frame her face gently between his thumb and forefinger, cupping her delicate jaw. The contact was shocking, hot, overwhelming. They always rejected the large things, Etienne repeated, his focus locked on the subtle tremor in her jawline. They want the sleek, the slender, the elegant, things that don't cast shadows. And you want the opposite. I want the true thing, the thing that accepts the weight. He leaned down further, until his rough chin was almost touching the top of her head. The silence returned, heavy and thick. You are so perfectly small. You feel like the right scale, the one piece that finally fits the gap. He didn't kiss her. He didn't threaten her life with words. He simply held her face captive between two fingers, forcing her to acknowledge the vast physical difference between them, the difference that he now claimed as his deepest obsession. "The rules are changing, Camille," he said, his voice dropping back to that low, resonant vibration. "Forget the debt. Forget your father. This is about what happens when something this small finds something this large." He withdrew his hand abruptly, breaking the oppressive contact. Camille finally drew a deep breath. Her skin felt cold where he had touched her. "And what happens?" she asked, her voice steady now, despite the adrenaline hammering in her chest. Etienne walked back to his chair, sitting down heavily. He picked up the cigarette case again, pulling out a smoke. This time, he lit it. The scratch of the match against the box was loud in the sterile room. He took a slow, deep draw, the smoke clouding the air briefly before the weak AC pulled it away. "The small thing doesn't break," he said, exhaling slowly. "It just gets absorbed." He put the cigarette between his lips and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The conversation was over. The game, however, had just begun. He watched her, waiting for the absorption to start. The ruin was complete. Now came the reckoning. The reckoning was silent. Camille sat rigid, her hands resting flat on the mahogany table. The wood felt cold, solid, reliable. Unlike the man across from her, he was a mountain waiting for erosion. "The paperwork is filed." "Yes," Etienne confirmed, the smoke from his cigarette blurring the air between them. He didn't look at her, but at the rising, grey plume. He was done with the transaction. Now he was moving to ownership. "Then I leave," Camille stated. It wasn't a question. It was a test of the steel in the room. Etienne took a slow, deep drag, letting the silence stretch until it was thin and brittle. No. The word was not aggressive. It was definitive, a fact of nature, like gravity. He put out the cigarette carefully in a heavy crystal tray, grinding the end until the ember was dead. He didn't stand up, but the shift in his posture was enormous. A predator lifting its head. "You confuse leaving with escaping," Etienne said, his voice low. "They are different things. Escaping requires risk. Leaving implies permission. I haven't given it." He stood then, slowly. The chair groaned under the release of his weight. It was a sound of relief, not protest. Etienne didn't move toward her. He moved toward the wall, where a heavy door, built of dark steel and disguised by a veneer of walnut, was set flush with the paneling. He placed his massive hand on the handle. The movement was economical. "I told you about the debt being irrelevant," he continued without turning. "That was true. The original reason is gone. The new reason is physical geometry." He opened the door. It made no sound. It was perfectly balanced, perfectly oiled. Beyond the threshold was a room designed for deep, heavy sleep. It was not opulent. Opulence was weakness. This was dense. The walls were covered in a dark, thick velvet, midnight blue, intended to suck up every sound, every echo, every stray particle of light. The carpet was deep pile, the color of wet earth. A single king-sized bed dominated the space, layered with crisp white linens that looked untouched, waiting. The air in the office had been filtered and cold. The air here was heavy, scented faintly with cedar and something sharper. Etienne's own cologne, perhaps, or the smell of high-grade leather, a luxurious cage. "You are meant for my shadow, Camille," he stated, finally turning back to her. His eyes tracked her immediate reaction, the subtle flinch toward the door. "You are the right size for the fit. I intend to prove that fit is permanent." He gestured with his chin toward the interior of the bedroom. "Go inside." Camille didn't move immediately. Her throat felt tight, dry. She looked past him, back into the sterile office, then back at the dark mouth of the bedroom. "This is confinement," she countered, her voice steady despite the hammer blow in her chest. "Confinement is a matter of perspective," Etienne corrected, stepping fully into the new room. He didn't turn on the light. The illumination came only from the spillover of the office, making the velvet walls seem deeper, swallowing the edges of the room. When the world outside is ruin, confinement is order. He walked over to a dresser, solid oak, built to withstand a siege, and opened a drawer. The movement of the wood was smooth, heavy. He pulled out a small, rectangular object, a keycard. He held it up. It glinted dully in the weak light. "No windows here. No balcony to jump from. The air is filtered. The door is steel," he said, his voice rhythmic, like a hammer falling. "You press this, and you walk out of this room. You cannot leave the floor. You cannot leave the building. You are absorbed into the structure." Camille finally stood, pushing the chair back slightly. The noise was startling in the silence. "My father's debt is paid," she insisted. "I am not collateral." Etienne didn't argue the point. He simply walked toward her, slowly, without menace, but with absolute inevitability. He stopped a foot away. The heat radiating off his massive body was overwhelming. He smelled of tobacco, clean soap, and raw power. He reached out, not for her face this time, for the back of her head, slipping his hand under the loose strands of her hair. His fingers were thick, but surprisingly precise. He didn't pull, didn't grasp. He simply supported the weight of her skull, forcing her head to tilt back slightly. The contact was not cruel, it was claiming. "Collateral implies temporary storage," Etienne murmured, his gaze dropping from her eyes to the small, visible pulse jumping in the hollow of her neck. "You are not stored. You are installed. Permanently." His thumb brushed the top of her spine, just below the hairline. A small pressure, a reminder of his control over the most fragile connection of her body. "You are scared of the size. I understand," he whispered, his chin nearly touching her forehead. The sound vibrated through her bones. "It's too much light, too much shadow. But you are meant for my shadow, Camille. You are the perfect size to hide in it." The air felt thin. She needed oxygen, but he was breathing it all. "My decision doesn't matter, does it?" she asked, the words barely a breath. Etienne paused. The weight of his hand was the only answer. "It matters only that you stop fighting the weight," he corrected. He pressed slightly harder with his thumb, a small testing push. "The fight is exhausting and pointless. The absorption has already happened. The reckoning is just the moment you finally realize you belong here." He withdrew his hand instantly, the sudden absence leaving her feeling unbalanced, cold. He returned to the dresser, picking up a heavy velvet box. He tossed it lightly onto the bed. "Clothes," he said. "Things that fit the structure, not the street." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Not desire, not anger, just deep, focused observation. He was waiting for her to move, to concede the point through action. "What do I do here?" Camille asked, the question flat, hollow. She looked at the bed, then back at him. the vastness of the space between his claim and her life. Etienne smiled then, a tiny, chilling movement that barely touched his thick lips. "You exist, Camille. You wait for the large thing to move," he instructed. He picked up the key card and slipped it into his own jacket pocket. "And you realize that your purpose is to prove the fit. Tonight, you sleep. Tomorrow, we begin the measurement." He turned, walking toward the office door. He paused at the threshold, blocking the light, making his silhouette even more imposing against the sterile backdrop. "Try the door when I leave," he added, a final unnecessary cruelty, just to confirm the structure. Then he was gone. The heavy steel door clicked shut. Not locked with a turn of a key, but sealed by the precise mechanism of a high-security vault. The silence rushed in, thick and absolute. The dark velvet walls drank the sound of her breath. Camille stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, listening only to the frantic drumming of her own heart. She felt the chill settle on her skin where his hand had been. She walked slowly to the door. Heavy wood, steel underneath. No handle on this side. She raised her hand tentatively and pressed her palm flat against the cool surface. She pushed. Harder. Useless. She was absorbed. The reality hit her not as panic, but as a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. Etienne didn't want a lover. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a structural necessity, a missing piece, and she was small enough to be it. Camille turned from the door. She looked at the velvet box on the bed. She walked toward it, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She opened the box. Inside were clothes, soft silk, dark cashmere, simple but impossibly expensive. Things for being indoors, things for being owned. Underneath the clothes, lying flat on the velvet lining, was a small, sleek object. Not a phone. It was a custom-made pistol, silver and black. Small enough to fit entirely in her palm, a perfect miniature weapon, a cruel joke, or a final test. Camille picked up the gun. It was heavy, cold. The metal felt right. It felt like risk. The measurement, she thought, looking at the dark room. He wants to know how far the fit goes. She gripped the pistol and walked back to the sealed door. She didn't try to open it again. She simply rested the barrel against the cold steel. The small thing doesn't break. It just gets absorbed. She closed her eyes. The problem was not the breaking. The problem was what she might break first. The night was long. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed, the heavy silence pressing down, the pistol warm in her lap, waiting for the large thing to return. She catalogued the sounds of the room, the faint whir of the air filtration system, the scent of cedar and Etienne's lingering presence. She hadn't been defeated. She had been misplaced, and a misplaced object was always a risk. The light eventually changed, a subtle graying that filtered in from the slight gap under the heavy door. Dawn. She stood up. She walked to the dresser and pulled out a clean, black silk shirt and simple trousers. She changed quickly, methodically. Survival was routine. The gun remained on the bed, positioned precisely on the white pillow. A statement. Just before the heavy, unseen mechanism of the door clicked again, signaling his return, Camille walked to the mirror and finally looked at her reflection. She looked smaller than ever, framed by the dark, absorbing walls. The door opened. Etienne stood there, freshly dressed, immense, the early morning shadows clinging to his face. He didn't need to speak. His eyes went directly to the gun on the pillow. He saw the silk, the small woman, the weapon. A flicker of something, satisfaction perhaps, crossed his face. "Good morning, Camille," he said. "Did you enjoy the quiet?" She walked away from the mirror toward the table he was setting up for breakfast. Coffee, heavy pastries, a bottle of dark water. "I prefer the noise," she answered, her voice completely even. He poured the coffee. black, strong. "The reckoning continues," he said, pushing a cup toward her. "Eat. We have work to do on the structure." The coffee was bitter, the way she liked it. It cut through the sweetness of the dense pain au chocolat. Camille ate slowly. She didn't look at the gun on the pillow. She didn't look at Etienne. She looked at the polished grain of the mahogany table, noting the slight imperfection in the wood near her left hand. Control the small space. Etienne was massive across from her. He ate with an efficiency that was almost brutal, consuming the food without savoring it. His hands, thick and scarred, made the heavy ceramic cup look like a child's toy. The silence was the main dish. It sat between them, solid and heavy. "The statement," Etienne finally said, nodding toward the bed. The weapon resting starkly on the white linen. Camille swallowed her mouthful. "Insurance." "Insurance against what?" "Against the structure breaking." He leaned back. The leather of the chair protested faintly. "You think I break things easily." "I think you break things when they don't fit." He stared at her. His eyes were dark, not black, but the deep, muted shade of old iron. They didn't blink often. "The structure is simple," he continued, pushing the remnants of his breakfast aside. "You owe me. Your father's debt. A massive, catastrophic debt. You are the payment, not the collateral. The payment." "I understand the calculus," she replied. "No, you don't." He lifted a finger, thick as a cigar. "The calculation I ran, the one every single man in this city ran, said you should have screamed. You should have been hysterical. You should have tried to escape the minute I left the room. You should have broken. That is the payment I expected. A woman who breaks under the weight of the consequences." She met his gaze, finally. And you polished the gun. You changed your clothes. You waited. You preferred the noise, you said. A genuine, thin smile touched his lips, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "That's the fit. You are small, Camille, but you don't break. You absorb. That's what I need." He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, consuming the air around her. He walked to a high cabinet built into the wall and retrieved a thick, worn leather folio. He dropped it onto the table. It landed with the weight of bad news. "The work," he said. The folio contained a dozen large folded maps, stiff with age and marked with red and black ink. They weren't maps of countries. They were maps of infrastructure, water lines, sewer grids, forgotten tunnels beneath the city's heart. "We have a leak," Etienne explained, resting his hands on the table, forcing her to look up at his chest, his jawline. "A bad one. The kind that sinks the ship, not just floods the lower deck." "A financial leak? Worse, a location leak. Someone is about to hit one of our secondary storage depots, the one under the old distillery on Rue Saint-André. They know the ingress point. We need to know who told them and how they got the precise coordinates for the pressure valve access point." Camille picked up the top map. It smelled of mildew and old paper. The precision of the hand-drawn lines was unsettling. "This is old construction," she observed, running a fingertip over the faded lines. "Pre-war tunnels. The structural data on these is usually junk. Use the junk." He poured her another cup of coffee. He didn't ask. He simply filled the space. The heat of the ceramic radiated against her palm. "I need a way out for them that isn't on this paper," Etienne stated. "A flaw in the structure they plan to exploit after the hit. A secondary escape route that only a historian or a true local would know. Find the ghost route." She began to unfold the maps, spreading them across the vast expanse of the mahogany. They covered the table completely. Etienne stood back, watching her work. She worked fast. Her mind moved faster than her hands. She ignored the red circles marking the depot. She focused on the blue lines, the flow of the forgotten water system, The pressure valve access point was critical. If they knew that, they knew the weak spot in the defense. "The leak isn't the maps," Camille said after 5 minutes of silence, her voice flat. Etienne didn't argue. He only said, "Explain." "The coordinates for the valve, they are too precise for guesswork. No one uses this system anymore, not publicly. To know this, they need direct access to the original survey plans, the ones filed right after the war." She lifted her eyes from the paper and looked at him. "Who has the original plans?" Etienne's massive jaw tightened. "The family archives. Locked down. Only 3 keys." "2 keys are accounted for," she pressed, still staring at the map, tracing a line with her finger that led nowhere. "1 is yours. 1 was your father's. The 3rd..." Silence stretched until it felt like thin glass. "Luke," Etienne finally ground out, the name tasting like ash. "My cousin, the architect. He designed the current security overlay." Camille laughed, a short, dry puff of air. It was a terrible sound. "The one who designed the defense is the one selling the keys to the door," she summarized. "Brilliant." "We knew it was internal," Etienne conceded, his voice low, controlled fury. "We didn't know how internal. Luke is a coward. He wouldn't risk the full hit. He needs an insurance policy of his own." Camille pointed to a faint, dashed line running parallel to the main sewer line, closer to the surface. "This line, it's marked Abandoned Siphon. But it was never abandoned. It was rerouted in '65 to the old brewery cellar." "The brewery burned down 30 years ago," Etienne dismissed. "The brewery burned. The cellar didn't. It leads directly to the river embankment, 4 blocks from the depot. It's the ghost route. Luke gave them the key to the valve so they could flood the lower level and disable the surveillance, but he gave them this route as their cleanup. It's too small for a truck, but perfect for 2 men carrying cases." She looked up at him again. "The problem wasn't solved. It was merely defined." Etienne didn't move. He didn't react with shock or relief. He simply processed the cold data she had delivered. She had just saved him millions, perhaps his life, by tracking a ghost line on a dusty piece of paper. "You fit the problem," he murmured. It wasn't praise. It was a mechanical recognition of utility. He walked around the table slowly. He didn't rush. His proximity was a heat source, a pressure field. He stopped directly behind her chair. She could feel the dense air of his presence. His shadow enveloped the small, dark woman sitting over the old maps. She held her breath without realizing it. This was the risk. Not the gun. Not the debt. The recognition. "Now," Etienne said, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. "We don't just stop the hit. We use the ghost route against them. We let them think they have the way out. We turn the cellar into a trap." His hand, immense and heavy, finally came down, not on her shoulder, not on her neck. It landed flat on the map, precisely on the point she had identified as the escape siphon. The paper crumpled slightly under the pressure of his palm. "Luke didn't sell them a route," Etienne stated, leaning down until his breath was warm on her ear. "He sold them their grave." Camille didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on the map, on the spot where his hand crushed the paper. She was intensely aware of the difference in size, the small scale of her existence against the brutal scale of his power. "What about Luke?" she asked, her voice steady despite the proximity. "Luke is the architect," Etienne said, a dangerous silence following the statement. "The architect must watch his structure fall apart. He gets to see the trap snap shut before he gets his payment." He straightened up. The immediate pressure was gone, but the residual heat lingered. "You understand the timing?" he asked. "The hit is tonight. They need the rising tide to flood the siphon for cover. Midnight." Etienne walked back to the cabinet. He opened it, revealing not files, but a small, specialized arsenal. Black leather, polished steel, heavy weights. The tools of his trade. He pulled out a compact satellite phone and tossed it across the room. It skidded on the table, stopping near her hand. "Call the men. Give them the coordinates for the cellar trap. Tell them, the exit is now the entrance to the end." Camille picked up the phone. Cold aluminum. She didn't hesitate. She already knew the numbers. She knew the language. She was the mind. He was the force. The fit was terrifyingly precise. "And you?" she asked, dialing the secure line. Etienne selected a heavy pistol, checking the magazine with a practiced, lethal grace. "I have a meeting with the architect," he said, his voice devoid of humor or mercy. "The structure needs to be rebuilt, and I start with the foundation." She listened to the heavy click of the safety being released. This wasn't just planning. This was execution. The line connected. A harsh, male voice answered in rapid French. "The exit is compromised," Camille said clearly, her voice sharp and authoritative. She gave them the exact GPS markers for the cellar, the precise location for the ambush. She sounded like she had been doing this for years. When she hung up, Etienne was standing by the door, ready to leave the room. He looked back at her. The small woman, still sitting at the table, surrounded by the blueprints of violence. She was the calm center of his storm. "You need to stay here," he commanded. "You are the operational anchor." She shook her head. "No." He stopped completely. His bulk filled the doorway. "No. I found the trap. I need to be there to ensure the timing is exact. Luke will have secondary codes. He's a coward, but he's thorough. I need to run the countercodes." He weighed her argument, not with approval, but with calculation. The risk of taking her was immense. The risk of leaving her behind, a loose element that understood the structure, was also immense. "You want to see the ruin," he observed. "I want to see the debt paid," she corrected him. "I want to see the structure hold." He looked at her, his eyes assessing every millimeter of her small frame. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the cold, dangerous focus in her expression. She wasn't asking for a thrill. She was demanding her role. "Fine," he decided, the word cutting through the air like a whip. "But you don't touch anything that breathes. You watch. You learn what the consequences feel like." He tossed her a small, heavy keycard. "Change your clothes again. Something that moves. The air down there smells like death and river water." He didn't wait for her to move. He simply turned and vanished through the door, leaving her alone with the heavy silence, the maps of the city's underbelly, and the bitter taste of coffee. Camille stood up. She walked back to the dresser. She didn't look at the gun. She didn't need it. She was already armed with something far more lethal, clarity. She was going into the dark, and she knew exactly where the ghost route led. She changed into the darkest clothes she owned. No silk, just thick cotton and utility. She strapped a knife, small and thin, to her ankle. She was ready to see the end of the line, and she was going with him. The realization settled in her gut, cold and absolute. She wasn't trapped by Etienne. She was trapped with him. The distinction was subtle. The danger was not. The air in the stairwell was thick, stale, a mixture of old cleaning fluid and the damp rot of a building that had given up on maintenance decades ago. Etienne didn't use the elevator. Too slow, too visible. He moved like a mountain that had learned to sprint. His coat, a heavy dark wool, barely shifted as he took the steps 2 at a time. Camille followed, forced to run to keep pace. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear of him, but from the raw, physical exertion of matching his tempo. The keycard he'd given her was heavy, cold. She felt its weight in her pocket, a physical tether to the danger. They reached the basement level. The lock mechanism was complex, industrial steel designed to keep the cold out and the contents safe. Etienne didn't bother with the key. He looked at the lock, then back at her. The codes failed 5 minutes ago. Your timing. They're running on a backup, she stated, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the dryness in her throat. Luke is meticulous about redundancy. Give me 20 seconds with the panel. I'll crash the loop. He stepped aside, his massive form filling the narrow corridor. He didn't offer a light. He didn't need one. His eyes adjusted instantly to the gloom. Camille knelt, pulling a small, specialized tablet from her utility pocket. The panel was old, scarred metal. She bypassed the external casing with a specialized tool, revealing the raw internal wiring. The complexity was expected. Luke's paranoia was her roadmap. Fingers flying across the screen, she wasn't breathing. She was calculating. Not equations, but milliseconds of risk. She found the redundancy loop, a sloppy piece of code meant to reset the system every time a forced entry was attempted. A ghost route back to safety. Now, she whispered, hitting the final command. A low, hydraulic thunk echoed through the basement. Not an alarm, just the sound of heavy machinery dying. The system was locked down, dead cold. Etienne didn't wait for confirmation. He put his shoulder into the steel door. Once, twice. The frame groaned. The third time, the heavy-duty bolts sheared with a sickening, high-pitched screech. The door flew inward, hitting the concrete wall inside with a deafening crash. The air on the other side was cleaner, colder. It smelled of ozone and expensive filtration. The artificial purity of a hidden bunker. Etienne walked through the breach. Camille stayed glued to the doorway, her tablet illuminating the dark space immediately inside. It was a staging area, crates, communication equipment, 3 men in dark tactical gear scrambling for weapons. They had been caught mid-preparation. The ensuing conflict was immediate, brutal, silent. Etienne was not a fighter. He was an eraser. He moved with a terrible economy of motion. His size was not a handicap. It was a weapon. The first man raised a rifle. Etienne intercepted the movement with a forearm that sounded like a steel beam hitting concrete. The man went down, silent, useless. The second man lunged with a knife. Etienne simply sidestepped, letting the momentum carry the attacker past him, then delivered a single, calculated strike to the base of the skull. The third man, the smart one, was already running, disappearing down a long, narrow corridor bathed in yellow sodium light. Etienne didn't pursue. He looked back at Camille, standing rigidly in the doorway, watching the wreckage. "Where is he?" Etienne asked. His voice was low, barely a rumble, entirely unmoved by the recent violence. Camille's eyes were fixed on the small map glowing on her tablet, the map of Luke's layout, derived from his obsessive spending habits and the ghost route. Sub-level 3, the core vault. He surrounded himself with the last of his protection detail. And a lot of panic. She spoke quickly, clinically. "The emergency power is off. He's running on generators. That corridor you saw? It's a funnel. No side routes for another 50 meters. Good." Etienne started toward the corridor, stepping easily over the unconscious bodies. "Stay on the comms. If the system resets, you shut it down again. Immediately." "Understood." She followed him, keeping the distance of a professional observer. She was fascinated by the scene. The violence was ugly, yes, but its execution was precise. It was the antithesis of the sloppy, emotional murders she had read about in the police files. This was business. This was the structure holding. They moved through the corridor. The air grew heavy, humid. It felt like walking into the throat of a machine. The corridor opened into a small, steel-reinforced lobby. 2 guards stood by a vault door, a thick, almost comical circle of steel. They were young, jittery. They saw Etienne coming and hesitated. They were trained for intimidation, not for this. Etienne stopped 5 feet short. He looked down at his hands, then up at the guards. "The man you work for is finished," Etienne stated, his voice flat. "Move, or be finished with him." The guards exchanged a frantic glance. They were paid well, but they were not martyrs. One dropped his weapon. The other followed instantly, hands raised. "The vault code?" Etienne demanded. "Don't know it," the first guard stammered, sweat slicking his temple. "It's biometric. Luke only." Etienne nodded slowly. He didn't look disappointed. He looked confirmed. He stepped past the guards, ignoring them completely, and approached the massive steel door. He placed his massive hand on the circular locking wheel. It was a gesture of ownership, not mechanics. "Camille!" he called, without turning around. She walked forward. The guards watched her. This small, delicate woman walking toward the boss, toward the end of everything. They looked confused. Why was she here? "The door is designed to resist anything short of a bunker buster," she explained, looking at the biometric scanner. "But Luke wired the system himself. He always leaves a manual bypass, something subtle, something he thinks only he would find." She pointed to a barely visible seam on the frame, near the floor. He needed access if his hands were dirty or wet. A power fluctuation bypass, disguised as a pressure sensor. Etienne knelt. The action made the floor vibrate. He was examining the seam she indicated. He didn't ask how she knew this detail. She had read his target better than the target read himself. He pulled a tool from his coat, a simple heavy steel bar, not built for finesse, but for leverage. He inserted the end into the seam. He didn't force it. He applied pressure. Slow, relentless. The steel frame groaned. A tiny, almost imperceptible click sounded from the core mechanism. The biometric scanner went dark. Etienne stood up. He looked at the door, then back at the 2 terrified guards. "Go," he told them. A dismissal that was more terrifying than a threat. They didn't need to be told twice. They vanished down the corridor, leaving their weapons behind. Etienne looked at Camille. The yellow sodium light reflected in his dark eyes. "You are good at finding the small places," he observed, the dry tone implying more than the words stated. "You are good at finding the vulnerabilities. I pay attention to the parts that aren't meant to be seen," she countered, meeting his gaze. He reached out and grabbed the locking wheel. He spun it once, twice. The heavy tumblers inside clicked open, sharp and final. He pushed the door inward. The room inside was a sparse office, but the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke and true terror. Luke was there. Luke, who had run Etienne's books for 5 years, who had betrayed the family structure for a clean exit, who owed Etienne a debt that ran deeper than money. Luke sat behind a large, empty desk, a bottle of dark liquor half drunk beside him. He wasn't armed, but he was surrounded by paperwork, the evidence of his greed, the documentation of the ghost route and the double cross. Luke looked up, his eyes wide, glazed with alcohol and disbelief. He saw Etienne, a wall of vengeance, filling the doorway. And then he saw Camille, small and dark, standing just behind Etienne's elbow, watching. Luke gasped. "The whore!" Luke spat, his voice shaking. "You brought the little analyst? She knows nothing. She's nothing." Etienne stepped fully into the room. He didn't acknowledge the insult or the presence of Camille. He simply looked at the man who had tried to build an empire out of betrayal. "The structure holds, Luke," Etienne stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate low. "The debt is calculated." Luke scrambled back in his chair, knocking over the liquor bottle. It shattered on the carpet, releasing the harsh, bitter smell of spilled whiskey. "It was a mistake, Etienne," Luke pleaded, holding his hands out uselessly. "I can fix it. I have the files. We can negotiate. Don't ruin me. Don't ruin the network." Etienne leaned over the desk. The sheer proximity of his bulk suffocated the air in the room. He didn't touch Luke. He didn't need to. "You ruined the structure when you assumed my size was a weakness," Etienne corrected him, the words slow and heavy. "You assumed I was too large to notice the small cracks. You didn't understand the reach." He motioned with a slight tilt of his head toward Camille, who remained perfectly still in the doorway, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed entirely on Luke's despair. "She found the small cracks," Etienne finished. Luke followed the motion, seeing the quiet, precise woman who had been his captive, the woman he had dismissed as a piece of decor. The realization of what she was, what she did, hit him harder than any punch. You are the countercode," Luke whispered, his voice dissolving into a ragged breath. "You are the fit." Camille took a single, deliberate step forward, moving out of Etienne's shadow and into the dim, artificial light of the vault. She didn't speak. She just looked at him. And in her eyes, Luke saw the absolute clarity of his own impending ruin. Etienne reached out, not for Luke, but for the stack of damning documents on the desk. He scooped them up, the evidence of Luke's betrayal, the proof of the ghost route that had been erased tonight. "The cost of the mistake," Etienne said, his attention now entirely on the paperwork. "It's settled." Luke looked past Etienne, toward the only way out, the massive, now locked steel door. He realized he was sealed in, with them. Panic clawed its way up his throat. He looked desperately at Camille, the only face in the room that wasn't promising immediate death. "Camille, please," Luke begged, his voice cracking. Tell him I can still be useful. Tell him I know things he needs to know. Don't let him—" He broke off as Etienne turned, holding the documents loosely in one hand. The silence that followed was suffocating. Etienne looked at Camille. He was giving her the chance to observe the final consequence, the lesson she had demanded. The structure had held. Now came the final payment. Luke watched her face, searching for a flicker of mercy, a sign of humanity. Camille looked back at Luke, the man who had taken her, who had used her father's debt as leverage, who had underestimated everyone in the room. She said nothing. Her silence was louder than any command. Etienne took a step toward Luke. The final step, the end of the line. Etienne took a step toward Luke, the end of the line. Luke didn't scream. He didn't charge. He collapsed inward, a man realizing the structure he relied on was gone, dismantled by a small, silent woman, and a man he thought he could outsmart. "Please," Luke choked out. "The name. The contacts. I can give you—" Etienne stopped a foot away. He tilted his head, the movement slight, almost casual. "You speak of utility," Etienne noted. His voice was low, quieter than the hum of the vault ventilation. "But your value was in the facade, the protection you offered Camille. Once she was here, and the code was broken, the facade cracked." Luke scrambled backward, his shoes catching on the thick, sound-dampening rug. He looked cartoonish in his desperation, a large man trying to shrink to nothing. "It was her father's debt. It was the risk," Luke pleaded, glancing desperately at Camille, who remained motionless, observing the proceedings with clinical detachment. "She was just collateral. I didn't know she was the goddamn key." "The structure always reveals the key," Etienne stated. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. It wasn't a pistol. It was a knife, a small, elegant blade, designed for precision, not spectacle. Luke's eyes went wide. He knew this move. This was the clean way. No sound, no immediate mess. He lunged, not toward Etienne, but toward the heavy mahogany desk, aiming for a paperweight. Anything. Etienne didn't move fast. He moved right. The knife flashed, not at Luke's throat, but at his wrist. The contact was quick, surgical. Luke screamed, a short, ragged noise, as the tendons in his dominant hand were severed. The pain was immediate, paralyzing. His hand flopped uselessly. The paperweight fell short. Luke stumbled back, gripping his ruined wrist, his face slick with panic and sweat. "The mistake," Etienne said, his breathing even. "You thought the size of the man was the risk." Etienne moved again. A second flash, this time higher, cleaner. Luke didn't hit the ground instantly. He staggered, the light leaving his eyes like a switch being thrown off. He crumpled into the rug, silent, a heavy weight. Silence. The only sounds were the distant hum of the servers and the faint, rhythmic dripping of something hitting the metal under the desk. Etienne cleaned the small blade on a linen handkerchief he withdrew from his sleeve. He didn't look down at Luke. He looked at Camille. Camille had not flinched, not a twitch of the eye, not a wasted breath. She was static, perfect. She was witnessing absolute control. This was what she had traded for, a danger that was contained, predictable, and clean. She stepped over the edge of the rug, moving closer to Etienne. She didn't look at the body either. It was irrelevant mass now. Etienne put the knife away. He looked smaller again, standing there, the violence finished, but the air around him was dense with authority. "He tried to escape the cost," Etienne murmured, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. Camille nodded once. "The structure does not permit evasion." It wasn't mercy she felt for Luke. It wasn't victory. It was the absolute, crushing weight of reality. Her father's debt was paid in blood and secrets. Her future was sealed in a vault with the man who owned the silence. Etienne gestured toward the desk, where the stack of Luke's damning papers sat next to the vault interface. "The route is clean. The system reset. The documents are proof," he summarized. He didn't ask her if she was ready. He simply waited for her confirmation. "The fit," Camille said, the word barely a whisper. She wasn't talking about the code anymore. She was talking about herself, her existence in his orbit, her purpose. He finally smiled. It was a slight upturn of the lips, devoid of warmth, pure recognition. "You understand the nature of things," Etienne confirmed. He stepped past her, moving toward the steel door controls. He activated the internal comms. "Clear the route. We are exiting." A static voice answered instantly, confirming the command. The massive locking mechanisms of the vault door began to cycle, a heavy, grinding sound of gears engaging, promising freedom from this tomb. Camille watched the door open. Beyond it, the sterile, brightly lit corridor of the safe floor stretched out. The world outside the vault was waiting. But the world outside was just another room in Etienne's house. He turned back to her, slipping the documents into a fireproof briefcase. He offered no hand, no comfort, only instruction. "We have a meeting in 2 hours," Etienne said. "They need to see the proof that the leak is plugged, and they need to see you." Camille absorbed the command. She was no longer a piece of collateral. She was proof. She was the countermeasure. She was the one who fit the structure. She walked toward the vault door, her gait steady. As she crossed the threshold, she glanced back into the room. Luke's body lay unmoving on the expensive rug. The dripping had stopped. The air already felt cold. She didn't feel guilt. She felt leverage. Etienne waited for her in the corridor. He didn't look tired. He looked complete. "The cost of underestimating," Etienne said softly, almost to himself, as the massive steel door began to close again, sealing Luke's ruin inside the vault. Camille stood next to him. She smelled the faint copper tang of blood on his coat. She didn't mind. She looked up at him. He was still physically smaller than most men in the organization. Smaller than Luke, smaller than the guards patrolling the halls. But he was the only one who mattered, the only one who saw the actual geometry of power. And now, she was part of that geometry. "Where is the meeting?" she asked, her voice dry, practical. "My study," Etienne replied. He started walking, not rushing, but moving with the certainty of a man who owns every inch of the path. "There are things we need to discuss. The next phase." He didn't mean business plans. He meant the next level of the risk, the next layer of their confinement. She kept pace easily beside him. Her clothes felt heavy, but she felt light, unburdened by the pretense of mercy or the lie of freedom. The corridor was long, polished steel and cold light. She walked straight ahead. The structure was built. Now they had to live inside it. The silence between them was the sound of a debt settled and a new, terrifying debt established. She didn't look back.